Well, good evening and welcome to Planning for the Future of Yaquina Bay. And Annie, if you could click on the meeting's being recorded, we'll get going. My name is Kent Doty. I am the Conservation Coordinator for the Audubon Society of Lincoln City. We have a great lineup of speakers this evening, and it's really great to see such a big turnout for this event. Presenters will talk about why estuary is important, what the management plan is all about, and how you can comment on the management plan. But before we begin, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement statement. Before the period of white settlement, the land and waters we now occupy on the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea peoples. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign Indian nations and to remember the dispossession they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and act collectively as part of the existing confederations. As we engage with wildlife and the environment that surrounds us today, we pledge to learn from these nations within the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, as well as our neighbors, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. We look forward to collaborating on common goals. This webinar is co-hosted by the Audubon Society of Lincoln City and Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. Audubon Society of Lincoln City has been serving Tillamook and Lincoln counties since 2006. Our goals are education, community science, conservation action, outings, including monthly birding outings and events like this. You can find out more about us through lincolncityaudubon.org. Our conservation focus areas include forests, practices, rocky habitats, marine reserves, water quality, threats to birds and wildlife, all viewed through the lens of climate change. Now I'll turn it over to Annie for a moment.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annie. I'm the Land Use Coordinator at Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. And Oregon Shores has been fighting to protect Oregon's coastal environment for more than 50 years. We grew out of the citizen campaign to pass the Beach Bill, which designated all Oregon beaches as public lands. We work throughout the coastal region from the Columbia River to the California border and from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf. Oregon Shores is a comprehensive regional conservation group, so we address a full range of issues, many of which you can see listed. We are perhaps best known for our Coast Watch program, through which volunteers adopt 1 mile segments of the Oregon shoreline and participate in citizen science surveys. Our land program handles many types of conservation concerns, but this spring we have been concentrating a lot on our state's estuaries. The estuary management plans for both Coos Bay and Yaquina Bay estuaries are under consideration, which brings us to tonight's webinar. And if you want to learn more about our work, you can visit oregonshores.org. Back to you, Kent.
Okay, tonight's program is being recorded and it will be available later for viewing on the web. We ask that you remain muted during the presentations and then when called upon during Q&A. The agenda is on the screen. There'll be a approximately 1 hour presentation. We're going to take a 5-minute Q&A after each speaker, and then we'll have additional Q&A at the end. You can put your questions if a question comes up during your presentation, you can put it in the chat, which is down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick up those in hands raised, virtual hands, after the speaker. We're delighted to have 3 expert panelists. Ethan Brown of the Willamette Partnership is a planning consultant developing the Yaquina Bay Estuary Management Plan update for Lincoln County, cities of Newport and Toledo. He thrives on cultivating partnerships among local organizations, residents, and public agencies as they work together to provide safe, clean, sustainable water quality solutions. And I'll just say Ethan and all the planners have done an amazing job to improve the functionality of the estuary management plan and really brought it up to date. Also speaking will be Annie Merrill, who's the Oregon Shores Land Use Coordinator, who studied estuarine ecology while obtaining her master's in marine resource management. Annie's dedicated to protecting critical coastal habitats to increase ecological resilience through climate change and fostering stewardship of Oregon's estuaries through encouraging public participation on land use planning. And I will say Annie's passion for estuaries is infectious, and it's great to be working with her. Our first panelist to talk is Laura Brophy. She's the director of Estuary Technical Group at the Institute for Applied Ecology in Corvallis. For over 20 years, Laura has provided leadership and science-based decision support for estuary restoration and conservation throughout the Pacific Northwest and the US West Coast. So let's welcome Laura and we'll get going.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen. And I'm really pleased to have a chance to speak with you today. How does that slide look? I'm going to assume it looks okay. Thank you, Annie. You've given me a good introduction, and I'm going to speak with you about the past, the present, and the future of tidal wetlands in the Yaquina Bay estuary. The information that I'm going to present comes from a lot of different projects that were funded and sponsored by many different organizations. And I've listed a bunch at the bottom of this screen that I've worked with quite a lot. And I'm really grateful to these organizations for moving our science forward. I've also been really lucky to work with a lot of dedicated and really nice people and effective people in these organizations and in others. And one of my valued colleagues was David Pitkin, who took this beautiful photo of Pool Slough back in 2002. You'll see this picture around, and I just want you to know David took it and it's beautiful. I guess you all know that. So to give you a little roadmap of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to discuss some of the impacts that people have had on the Yaquina Bay estuary since white settlement. And then I'm going to talk about how those impacts have altered tidal wetland conditions, affecting the functions and ecosystem services that benefit people and the many other creatures that use the estuary. And in the future, human-caused climate change, of course, will be a big factor. And so I'm going to talk about how that will affect tidal wetlands. And then in the last part of my talk, I'll let you know about some of the actions that we can take to help improve estuary resilience and reduce the impact of the past changes and those that are coming up. So the focus of my talk is on these types of tidal wetlands, the emergent tidal wetlands, also called tidal marsh or salt marsh. And that kind of tends to fall into low marsh and high marsh. Of course, there's no lines in nature. And then the forested and shrub dominated tidal wetlands, which are also called tidal swamp collectively. Oh, and I should mention that other types of wetlands are very important too, like eelgrass and even those mudflats, but they aren't the focus of my talk today. So starting with the subject of human impacts after European arrival in the 1800s. So here's the overview of the estuary. You're all familiar with where things are here, Toledo and Boone Slough, Newt Slough. Can you see my cursor, or is that not visible? Okay, in the middle, Boone Slough, Newt Slough. Yeah, I'd have to have my cursor over on the other screen, and I think I'll just describe things visually. Newport at the mouth of the river. So my next two maps are from a study completed in 2019, funded by the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership. That's a really great group that I've collaborated with for about a decade. And this map shows what tidal wetlands looked like back in the mid to late 1800s, before there was much alteration by Euro-Americans. And the colored areas are within tide range today, and they were tidal wetlands or tidal waters back then. So blue represents the open water and mud flats. And then orange represents areas that were historically tidal marsh. And then the greens are the tidal swamp areas, dark green being forested and lighter green being shrub tidal swamp. And this is what things look like today. So you're familiar with the fact that many of the former tidal wetlands are diked and no longer subject to tidal influence, including that big loop in the middle of the estuary called the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex. And then those big arms sticking up above Toledo, Depot Slough and Olalla Slough. So all those areas no longer receive tidal influence. And this represents a big change in the distribution of habitat types, both spatially and in terms of how they're distributed among the different types. So these changes make up a 78% loss of tidal marsh from the estuary, and a 92% loss of forested tidal wetlands, and a 95% loss of shrub tidal wetlands. So those are pretty big changes. And the Yaquina isn't alone in this situation. That study that I'm drawing these data from covered 15 estuaries on the Oregon coast, which together make up about 97% of tidal wetlands on the Oregon coast. So this is a pretty comprehensive study. And overall in the 1800s, these 15 estuaries contained about 15,000 hectares of tidal wetlands. And today we're down to only about half that total. But as you can see from the colors on this bar chart, blue represents tidal marsh, green represents tidal swamp. Most of the loss was to tidal swamp. And that's partly because we've restored quite a bit of tidal marsh and there has been some new tidal marsh formed. But regardless of what's happening with the tidal marsh, you can see that the tidal swamp's been very hard hit. And the fact that it made up more than half of our tidal wetlands historically means that we should really be concerned about that, because that's got to have big impacts. So just to give you a few images of what these wetlands looked like before things were altered much, this is that great photo by David Pitkin, and it's a pretty good image of what the tidal marsh would have looked like. And in fact, that Boone Slough Newt Slough complex, that big loop, would have looked a lot like this, because that was tidal marsh back then. Then in terms of tidal swamps, this photo is actually from the Nehalem River estuary. And it shows what these Sitka spruce tidal swamps look like. And this would be at high tide. And this is what spruce swamps up Depot Slough or up Olalla Slough would have looked like back then. A few more photos from tidal swamps. This is in the Nehalem. That's a low beaver dam that holds back water at low tide, doesn't reach the top of bank at all. These intertidal beaver dams are very interesting. Here's the tree root platforms and buttresses of a Sitka spruce holding water back at low, this happens to be at about mid-tide, but that water will remain at low tide. And these kinds of sheltered pools and ponds make great habitat for young salmon. This is in the Yaquina. You can see how much large woody debris is found in these channels of these tidal swamps. They're very complex structurally. And I also just think these tidal swamps are very beautiful. They have interesting layered vegetation. So, of course, the question arises, what happened to them all? And you can tell some from this picture that many of them were diked. This was the primary cause of tidal swamp loss, was diking and installation of tide gates to convert the former swamps to agricultural use, mostly pasture. And that's what happened to most of the former tidal marshes as well. So tide gates can range from simple flap gates like the one on the left here to more complex regulated tide gates like the ones on the right, but they all keep the tides out. Primarily, they may let some tides in, the muted tide regulators may let some in, but they don't restore full natural processes to these wetlands. So going back to this overview of the estuary from 200 years ago, I've circled Depot Slough and its stream tributaries. And you can see that over half of the tidal wetlands within that circle were these tidal swamps, forested tidal swamps. In fact, this was pretty much the largest block of forested tidal swamps in the estuary historically. And today, these areas are behind tide gates. This aerial view shows the Depot Slough tide gates at the bottom of the slough there, bottom of the photo. This is looking north with Toledo on the lower right corner. And then as you move up Depot Creek, you could get into where the former tidal swamps used to be. And then much of the rest of this image here was tidal marsh historically. Then Olalla Slough is another of these large tide gated systems just at the east edge of Toledo. And you can see the tide gates and dike there. The freshwater intake for the paper mill is behind the dike and tide gates. So that's the water source for their operations. And most of the image that you can see marked former tidal marsh was tidal marsh historically, but north of Sturtevant Road, their tidal swamp predominated. And besides all the diking and tide gating, logging happened because trees need to be removed to convert the land to agriculture. And it was also lucrative, and the logs were needed During World War I, there was huge demand for Sitka spruce for airplanes. And there was a whole Army division devoted to harvesting spruce in the Pacific Northwest. So this was a big impact and important to the war effort. And the spruce that were growing near rivers were easier to transport on the water down to mills. So you can bet that the tidal swamps were among the first places where trees were taken out. And as I mentioned before, the cleared land is needed for agriculture as well. So there were multiple purposes to the logging. So these big changes have led to changes in our estuary conditions that bring us to the current time, and they affect the functions that we value. So I'll talk a little bit about these functions. Tidal wetland losses have impacts to many functions. Tidal wetlands perform a number of functions, as do other wetlands, and this is a list that I won't go into detail on these, but it's probably the case that if you lose 80 or 90% of your tidal wetlands, then you're probably losing 80 or 90% of these functions as well. Sorry, I'm just noticing in the chat, is there an issue with the way my screen appears?
Everything's looking good on my end. I tried to advise continue. I think it's okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry if there's some problem. All right. So continuing with the functions here. Paul Adamus's document that's linked on this page, and I will share a PDF of this presentation so you all can go to these links. You can go to his publication for quite a few details on these many functions. And I'd like to move to some of the functions that have particularly high levels within these tidal swamps. And we're just learning about these salmon habitat and carbon sequestration functions of tidal swamps really only within the last decade has there been any information at all on these topics. So this is pretty much breaking news. Tidal swamps provide excellent salmon habitat for juvenile salmon that are foraging in the estuary. The deep and complex tidal channels that you saw pictures of earlier with all that large woody debris provide really great shelter for young fish, both from predation and also at low tide, they have these pooled areas where the fish can stay in the forest, in the forested swamp, rather than having to go out into the main stem river. And so they're protected from predation and also from high river flows that might wash them down to the ocean before they're ready. And speaking of going to the ocean, these tidal swamps occur in the brackish to freshwater zone of the estuary. And so they provide salt adjustment opportunities. So young fish can gradually adjust to salt levels and move back and forth between saltier and less salty environments. And that's very important for their ocean survival. Beaver ponds are a big part of the tidal swamp picture. Beaver like these environments and build ponds and dams, and those ponds are excellent habitat for young salmon. They are helped along by very high energy prey production. The complex structure of the canopy in a tidal swamp with the multi-layered vegetation produces a lot of insects, a diversity of insect life. And those insects fall into the water and become salmon food. And insects happen to have quite a lot higher calorie count compared to, say, amphipods or some of the other crustaceans that fish tend to eat down in the tidal marsh. So some folks have found that these tidal swamps provide very high energy food for salmon, which again is very important to their growth and subsequent ocean survival. So carbon that's stored in tidal marsh and tidal swamp and other coastal habitats is called blue carbon. And this slide just is a quick schematic of what we mean by blue carbon. So carbon is taken up by plants from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. And then it's stored in the tissues of the plants and in the soil. And by being stored there, it's kept out of the atmosphere, which helps reduce global warming and other climate change problems. Now, wetlands do also emit greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane during the respiration cycle and other microbial activity. And those greenhouse gases actually contribute to climate change. But research so far shows that most tidal marshes and tidal forests seem to provide a net climate benefit. Pacific Northwest tidal wetlands in general store a lot of carbon, and our tidal forested wetlands are among the highest in the world in terms of carbon storage. On the right, this is a graph showing the amount of carbon stored in the soil. That's the orange part of each bar, and then in the plant material, which above ground, which is the green part of the bar. And so the tidal forested wetlands are on the right. You can see the yellow box and the black arrow. Pacific Northwest tidal forests were higher than any of the global mangrove averages, and mangroves are considered to be very high performers in carbon sequestration. So that was very interesting to learn during this study that we completed in 2020. This was done by our Blue Carbon Working Group. And then as you look at the averages for different kinds of tidal marsh, that's sort of the middle group of bars there. Again, you can see that the Pacific Northwest tidal marsh outperformed most of the other tidal marshes. And so this is exciting news, and it's made some headlines. So in terms of climate change and sea level rise, if we're talking about carbon sequestration and how that can mitigate climate change, we also need to know what we're trying to avoid. So I'm going to look to the future and talk about how sea level rise might affect our tidal wetlands in the Yaquina. This project, I'm sure many of you know about, was funded by OWEB and the US Fish and Wildlife Service's coastal program. And we modeled sea level rise impacts to Oregon tidal wetlands in general across, I think, 21 estuaries. So again, the vast majority of the tidal wetlands on the coast were included in this study. And there's a couple websites, items linked here. One is the Midcoast's website where you can get good information about this project. And then the link below is the report. So the project, my organization, the Estuary Technical Group at the Institute for Applied Ecology, did the analysis and the reporting, and Fran Recht led our effort to bring these results out to the communities. So our analysis relied on the fact that tidal wetlands form in a fairly narrow elevation range. So this is a cross section of the estuary showing where different types of habitats would form. And this was originally a very rough sketch by me, but Joshua Shackley kindly turned it into this nice graphic. And on the left, you can see a tidal bay or river. And then the shore is the shoreline, the cross section of the shoreline is that white line. And so you can see as it rises up to the mudflat, and then you get into that part of the tide range that is suitable for vegetated tidal wetlands like tidal marsh and tidal swamp. That's what I have labeled as the current extent of tidal wetlands. It's about mean tide level to the annual high tide mark. And in the future, with sea level rise, the area of land that's at that appropriate elevation will be shifting landward. And that's what's labeled here as the possible future extent of tidal wetlands. And we have a nickname for that, calling it the LMZ, or the landward migration zone, since these wetlands have to migrate landward. And you can also see, looking at the slope of that white line, that when it gets steep, that vertical elevation range that represents the appropriate elevations for tidal marsh and tidal swamp, that will represent a smaller land area because the steeper slope makes it smaller. And I'll show you in real life what that looks like. So this is a map from that project, looking at how the available area for tidal wetlands looks right now. With 0 centimeters of sea level rise, about 824 hectares are at the appropriate elevation for development of emergent or forested tidal wetlands or shrub. That's the dark blue area. So the next scenario that we analyzed was just 9 inches of sea level rise. And within the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex in the middle, that's that loop, the former cutoff meander of the river, you can see some orange patches showing up. And that means those areas are now, relative to the sea level that I'm presenting here, they're now below mean tide level. So they're less likely to support vegetation, which makes them vulnerable in many ways. As we get to 1.5 feet of sea level rise, you can see the orange expanding within that Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex, and some orange appearing in the Depot Slough and Olalla Slough wetlands. Now, these areas are all behind dikes and tide gates now, and so they've undergone subsidence. That means the elevation of the land surface has dropped due to a number of factors like oxidation of organic matter and compaction. So they're low compared to what the original tidal wetland elevation was, which is why they're turning orange in these slides. So 2.5 feet of sea level rise, 4.5 feet of sea level rise, And now we get to some higher scenarios, 2.5 meters or 8 feet of sea level rise. You can see a lot of the current tidal wetlands have converted to this orange color. And there's also blue areas forming within industrial lands, like the mill, the paper mill site in Toledo. And those blue areas are within tide range at this scenario. This is the highest scenario we looked at, and it doesn't look good. We have, in the Yaquina, there's not some upstream broad floodplain where these tidal wetlands can migrate to. We have narrow, confined river valleys above the estuary. So it's not a happy thought, but also this is not the entire picture. There is some possibility that wetlands can maintain in their current locations if there's adequate sediment delivery, and we have good sediment supplies on the Oregon coast. But we have to make sure these wetlands can receive sediment, which means taking out barriers to sediment deposition like dikes. So that's one of the actions we can take. And among the other actions that we can take is we have to make sure we do protect the remaining intact tidal wetlands within the estuary. These are wetlands that have all the natural processes in place. They have the capability, if any place does, they have the capability to maintain themselves with sea level rise. So they're very important. And restoring diked former tidal wetlands gives those places a fighting chance to try to keep pace with sea level rise. And the longer we wait to restore these wetlands, the less likely they are to be able to maintain vegetation with sea level rise. We want to get sediment coming in as soon as possible. And I recognize that many of these diked areas are both culturally important and they have economic importance. So there's always a need for prioritization. That's not the next bullet, but using previous studies and prioritizations to guide our actions is vital. We also need to look to the future and protect these landward migration zones, these areas that may be the tidal wetlands of the future. And there's a lot of research that still needs to happen. We have a lot of burning questions. So in terms of prioritization, obviously we don't have enough money to restore everywhere. And also there are better places and worse places to do restoration based on those cultural factors and community needs that I described earlier. So there's several different approaches to prioritization. One is, as I was mentioning, to look for areas that might be more resilient to sea level rise and focus on those. Another would be to prioritize areas that are most highly, or wetland types that are most highly impacted, like those forested tidal wetlands. And a lot of data indicates that sediment supply and freshwater inputs, which affect salinity, they reduce salinity, are important for climate change resilience. So we actually need to develop approaches like full estuary hydrodynamic models that can help us consider these factors when we choose where we want to take action. And then finally, letting beaver and other non-human system engineers help us is important because beaver can really contribute to climate change resilience in many ways. So as an example of a prioritization map, this is from that 2017 sea level rise study. And this prioritizes the landward migration zones for the 4.7 foot sea level rise scenario. And the prioritization factors are shown at the upper right there, the size of that retreat zone, the landward migration zone, the ownership of that area, the land use zoning for that area, and the current development status, because zoning isn't the same, of course, as what's currently on the ground. And so the green and blue areas on this map are ranked higher priority for restoration and conservation when sea level rise is being considered. And the lower priorities are orange and red. I've blocked out with black those impermeable surfaces that represent developed sites, which aren't appropriate for tidal wetland restoration. One of the most exciting developments in the Yaquina last year was when the Oregon Central Coast Estuary Collaborative was awarded this focused investment partnership grant from OWEB. And this encompasses a suite of projects in the Yaquina and Alsea estuaries. And the FIP grant will fund these projects, and they'll be coordinated by the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council. And these projects draw from the prioritizations and studies that I've just been showing you. So this is really neat to see prioritization in action here. So for example, this FIP project type 1, the project sites on this map are from a study that I finished up in 1999, which prioritized restoration sites for the estuary in general. And then FIP project type number 2 results from the 2019 study I've been showing you that identified the really high impact to tidal swamps, the high losses of tidal swamps, and set a priority for restoring them. So this part of the FIP addresses that priority. And then FIP project type 3, it looks at these sea level rise areas and looks at the landward migration zones and takes action in those areas. So it's just gratifying to see these studies moving forward into on the ground action. So I'm getting close to the end of my time here. So I think this is almost my last slide. And I just want to cite and provide you links, which you can grab later from a PDF, to these studies that supported this talk. There's more data needed, particularly on these burning questions. And when I say support research, I really think that it's most important for the future of the estuary to support research that's directed towards action. So research on what are some of the best methods to restore these forested tidal wetlands? What do our carbon storage and our greenhouse gas exchange functions look like in these wetlands? We're starting to get data, but there's a long ways to go. About sediment transport and how it will affect sea level rise resilience. And then the sort of the elephant in the room, the co-seismic subsidence that can occur with a large earthquake. How will that affect our wetlands? Oh, and I want to mention this survey that Fran Recht designed and has distributed and is writing up now on tidal swamp restoration methods. And the report's in preparation, and I think this is going to be really useful for people who are working to restore tidal swamps. So there, I've ticked off those 4 topics, and I think we have a little time for questions. I ran slightly over, but we could do some questions now.
Folks, if you have a question, you can put them in chat during the presentation, or you can put it in now, and I'll scroll through there's one question popping up. If I hear you correct, it's from John French. If I hear you correctly, much of the loss, oh, my chat just went away. If I hear you correctly, much of the loss of tidal wetlands through dikes and tide gates has occurred in order to increase beef production, not agriculture. Do you believe a more plant-focused diet would positively affect these tidal wetlands?
I suppose in the big picture it could, but the culture on the coast of pasture and beef production is there, and agriculture is not only a response to the market but also a cultural phenomenon. So yes, I think switching, if everybody switches to not eating meat, that might change things. But a lot of the production is dairy as well. So it's not only beef. I mean, in the Yaquina, I don't think we have dairies, but Tillamook, for instance, has a lot of dairies. So, and there's sheep pasture too. It's a range of pastures. Yeah.
Another question that's come up is, I live in Olalla Slough. From your presentation, it looks like restoration of tidal swamp along it.
Yeah, if restoration were to occur, tidal swamp would be likely to form in the upper reaches of Olalla Slough. The lower reaches were historically tidal marsh, which tells me that it was salty enough that trees didn't survive in that wetland. And that would still be true, and perhaps even more so with restoration now. But I don't think I've ever heard anyone seriously proposing restoration in Olalla because of the water supply for the paper mill coming from that diked wetlands. So that's going to be that's something that would stand in the way of any restoration effort there.
So questions are coming in. Well, that one's already been there. Any new questions? Or you can raise a virtual hand too. I have one I'll put out there. Has dredge spoils disposal been ever used successfully to restore tidal marshes with sea level rise?
There is placement of additional fill material has been tested in some locations. South Slough did a good study on that. The Coons Marsh study. One of the challenges is the cost. It's quite expensive to use dredge material placement to elevate to raise the elevation of an entire wetland, but it's a possibility. Thin layer placement is used in some areas. So I think it's out there as a possibility, yeah. One thing I would be very cautious of is any proposal to place dredged material onto existing tidal wetlands. That would be a very bad idea because they already exist in equilibrium, and they also have vulnerable plant communities and also all sorts of ecosystem characteristics that would be damaged by dumping dredged materials on them. So, but within a restoration site, as a part of a careful design, there might be a role for dredged material placement.
Another question that's come in. Oops, just maybe pop back. Is there a benefit to putting culverts along the Bay Road to let water into areas across the road from the bay?
If there are areas that are not currently receiving tidal fluctuation that used to in the past, yes, I would think getting some tidal exchange into those areas could be important. Yeah, I think the plan identifies restoration sites, and hopefully those areas are being identified in that plan, I hope.
Okay, we got time for probably 2 more questions. Could you comment on the amount of private versus public land that is being affected, and what is the planned preserver for private property value and owner rights?
All of the projects that I've worked on were the landowner decided they wanted to do the restoration. So those landowners had made a decision that they valued the restored condition highly, and often they are compensated through different programs, federal programs that can pay the landowner for some of the costs. And so I think that it's always willing landowners only in the work I do. So no one is giving up any rights that they didn't already want to give up. In fact, they're not giving up any rights. They're choosing to do restoration. There's a lot of public lands restoration going on as well.
Okay, I think we should probably move on to our next speaker. Fascinating, Laura. Thank you for that presentation. We'll follow up with more questions at the end for you and the other presenters. So next up is Ethan Brown.
Thanks, Kent. Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Ethan. Now I can see it.
Great.
Good.
That's my colleague, Nicole Manis, who's also working on this project. Thanks for being able to hop on this too, Nicole. So hi, everyone. I'm Ethan Brown, Community Water Partner at Willamette Partnership. I'm going to be going fairly quickly because most of the time I've timed this presentation, it's been like 20, 25 minutes. So I'm going to try to move quickly through it. So I wanted to talk to you about today, this project we've been undertaking for a little over 2 years now to update the Yaquina Bay Estuary Management Plan. We're going to talk about the needs for doing so, the process that we've undertaken, and the proposed revisions and potential outcomes that we think that this will benefit the Yaquina Bay communities. So the reason why we're doing this is because basically the Oregon's estuary management plans are fairly old. They are, most of them were passed in the very late 1970s, early 1980s. So 40 plus years old. There's been a lot that's changed since that period of time. And there's a lot that we know now that we didn't know then. The Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development is sort of helping a few different communities, Coos Bay's Estuary Management Plan, Lincoln County's Estuary Management Plan for Yaquina Bay, update these EMPs, and they kind of viewed the Yaquina Bay EMP as a pilot to see how can it work in an area which you have multiple jurisdictions, and can we find an efficient and effective way to do so. So part of the role that we're playing is to determine, is this a good model for other communities to follow, and kind of lay out, these are the lessons that we've learned, and maybe you can improve upon what we've done so far in other places. So a quick refresher for estuary management plans in general. These are required by Goal 16, so the Oregon statewide planning Goal 16 for estuarine resources. The cause for this goal is to manage the uses and activities within the estuary. So a good way of thinking of this is any area in the estuary that's open water, that's tidally influenced, that's brackish, all the way up to the line of non-aquatic vegetation is within the regulatory extent of these estuary management plans. So they're regulating what's going on in these areas. And that regulatory extent, that big area, all of Yaquina Bay, up through some of the side channels, that is being chopped up into smaller pieces called management units. And each management unit has a classification, so natural, conservation, or development. And each of those classifications has a list of things that are permissible, that are allowed to do, things that are conditional, as in you can do them under certain conditions, and anything that's not under those are not allowed. So I want to start off by saying that Goal 16, as we learned over the course of this plan update, is very prescriptive, as in that list of what activities are allowed or conditional or not allowed is pretty much set in stone outside of a goal exception or a change at the state level for the actual language of that Goal 16 for the statewide planning goal. And then there are a number of other things within the plan that impact how and what happens in the bay. So for instance, if you're going to disturb any land inside the estuary, like dredging or installing something, you have to provide an impact assessment that basically says, this is what I'm going to do. And it's information to make sure that who's planning the project is taking certain things into account. And I'll go into that in more detail later on. And then there's also a very specific compensatory mitigation program in place for any sort of intertidal areas. So there's a lot of background on this project, and Nicole and I have been working on this for a long time. And we are members of Wellland Partnership, which is a conservation nonprofit in Oregon. And we're partnering with University of Oregon's Institute for Policy Research and Engagement, which has really led the spatial data analysis and the map making component for this. Matt Spangler, who is a consultant for Lincoln County, helped us throughout. His help has been just amazing. He has 40 years or more of estuary management planning experience. He actually helped write the original Yaquina Bay Estuary Management Plan for Lincoln County. And there's no one who's better at this than him. So as I said, we've been working on this for quite some time. We've been doing multiple different things, including needs and gaps assessment, gathering data, including like different types of spatial data, eelgrass bed locations, things like that. We've been actually updating the plan language, and we've gotten all the way to this point where we have a draft plan that we're engaging the public in through town halls in the next 2 weeks or so. And then at the end of August, we're going to hand over this draft plan and all of the maps and the data that goes along with it to the jurisdictions to go through their own plan amendment review process. So that includes planning board meetings and city council and county planner meetings. Now, there have been a lot of people who've been working on this project with us. Even though we've done a lot of work to, I guess, pull together the data and the actual plan drafts, we have not been making a lot of key decisions. That really is the role of the steering committee. So the steering committee is composed of local jurisdictions, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the ports, and DLCD. So they've been helping guide us with regards to what's the data that needs to be included, who should be invited for sort of a first wave of advisory group members, and then the actual draft plans in terms of like, this is what can and cannot be included, and sort of stamping the process along the way. As you may note, this is a very large advisory group. We took a very inclusive process for this, basically an open door. If someone was interested in joining the advisory group, we said yes. And you may also notice that there are a lot of agency folks, and that is from state and federal sources. That's because there's a lot of interaction between various agencies, regulatory oversight, just actual interests from those agencies in estuaries and in this planning process. And the role of the advisory group, which was immensely helpful throughout this, was to really help us with the spatial data and the climate change information and vetting these climate vulnerabilities for certain areas of the bay, in addition to very detailed feedback on the plan itself. And we tracked their feedback through a summary of consultation, very formalized document, specific comments from them, our response. We had the steering committee sort of weigh in on that, and then we'd have a formal response in the end. So we very much so treated this like they were helping guide us through this process as well with the steering committee. So to speak about the process, we did a thing called a needs and gaps assessment, which is basically a milestone in the planning process to determine what's missing out of the plan and what could be improved. And then we took that and said, well, these are the changes that we think should probably be making within the plan. And we created new drafts, and we brought that to the advisory group and the steering committee. We went through these cycles where we bring them plan drafts. The steering committee would say, this looks good. Let's hear from the advisory group. The advisory group would provide incredibly detailed feedback. We would review and address that and provide a lot of edits. And then the steering committee would say, okay, these parts of the plan are done. Let's move to the next ones. And to a certain point in which we now have a draft plan that we released to the public, and we're hoping that the public will be able to weigh in, provide some really detailed feedback to create another iteration that is later eventually brought to the jurisdictions for their plan amendment process. And I'm sorry for the very planner technical heavy jargon. This is what the information is, but it's a lot more natural to me because I am a planner. So throughout this process, we have been engaging stakeholders. We have an informational website that's been live for, I think, over a year. We initially held some community conversations, and then we got to plan making process. We held an informational open house a few months or so ago, which was our first standalone meeting, where we brought the plan, concepts, information about the estuary and climate change, all of that to people, had them provide some feedback on that. And at this point, we're now holding town halls, which are going to be July 6th, July 10th, and July 11th at Newport, Toledo, and a virtual one on July 11th. We're hoping that you can join us there. And we're actually holding a public comment period that'll close at the end of that week on July 14th. And so any comments you provide to us, we're going to be tracking, we'll address it, and we'll be providing a spreadsheet afterwards on these are the comments we received, and this is how we addressed it, and this is what, whether or not it makes it into the plan and the reasons why. So now that I've talked about all this process stuff, I'd like to talk about the actual plan. So we performed this needs and gaps assessment, and it was a very structured way to say, we want to modernize this plan. We know it's 40 years old and needs to be modernized. Well, these are the objectives we're undertaking to modernize it. We want to improve the plan implementation, improve alignment with Goal 16, things like that. We also knew that we needed to update the data and digitize maps. That's actually a hand-drawn map off to the side that planners have been using to make key decisions regarding land uses and estuarine land uses for some time now. And they would really love to have a digital version of that. And we also wanted to include climate change in some way, incorporate it into it, but we didn't know how at first. There's been quite a lot of data analysis, and I have to say that Dr. Laura Brophy's work, especially her data that she's been able to provide with regards to sea level rise and landward migration zones, as you can see here, it's a lot due to her. I mean, she's the cited source for these landward migration zones. So IPRE has been able to provide a large list of all the different map inventories, and the advisory group will come back and say, we'd actually like this data, like this types of topic to be visualized. We're able to provide it. So for instance, soft sediment fauna, fish species, there were a lot of maps that weren't part of the initial iteration. The advisory group helped make sure that those were part of the plan that would eventually be adopted by the county and by the cities. This is a very quick slide on what actually are some key highlights for the plan itself. So we know that the maps are going to be digital versions are going to replace hand-drawn ones. We know that a lot of the outdated language is being replaced. There's actually this weird permitted use matrix from the original plan, which is very confusing to honestly use. And even the planners who use it for many, many years would have challenges figuring out exactly what is it describing. That's being replaced with a very simple narrative of estuary zoning districts. So very similar to what you would see in a normal zoning district for a city or a county that says, R1 residential, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. So things like that. There have been changes to certain management units. So some have been split up because there may have been a really important natural area within a development management unit. And so now that natural area is classified as natural, and the other one, it's been split up from it. So it is as it was before development. A few ones have been reclassified. And overall, we're trying to just better align what are the on the ground conditions with, should it be more for protection or should it be more set aside for development? We've actually been able to incorporate climate change really well into this plan, we feel like, as far as that we can go without some sort of additional guidance from the state. I'll get into that shortly. But we've been able to incorporate that as an informational way when people are planning projects in the Bay. And adaptive management. We have drafted a whole new plan part 11, called Plan Updates. And the idea of that is, not the entire plan doesn't have to change all the time. You don't have to wait 40 years in order to make any changes to the plan. We know that sea level rise is happening. We know that there's a lot of great restoration work happening, and probably dikes and tide gates are going to be removed. So let's make sure that when those do happen and it alters the local conditions, we're able to update the plan, update certain maps, and make sure that it reflects the current reality. And lastly, we went from about 8 restoration sites, and you need to have a list of restoration sites as per goal 16. Went from about 8 of them to over 40. And the way we did that was by saying, there's been a lot of great prioritization work that's already been done by researchers, by watershed groups. Let's just say if it's been publicly available and provided by one of these types of entities, it's being included in the plan as potential restoration sites. And that's just to say that if someone's interested in getting it restored and they own that land, they can. They are under no obligation in order to restore it themselves or give it off to a conservation entity. So this is going to get probably even more technical, and I'm sorry for folks, but it's a really important piece about it. So for climate change, we knew that we had to incorporate climate change in some way into this plan. And we saw this impact assessment process as a really good place for that. So anytime you're breaking ground inside the estuary, let's say you're digging a hole, you have to provide impact assessment. Now, this has 4 basic questions. It asks, what are you doing? Where are you doing it? What are the potential impacts to habitat? And what are your plans to mitigate those impacts? And it's informational entirely. It's just to make sure that whoever's planning this project is thinking through their actions in order to not hurt the estuary more than they have to. So what we're asking then is, what if you consider the potential interactions of your project with specific climate vulnerabilities for that area? And so the estuary is also split up into sub-areas in addition to management units. There's 7 big sub-areas. So it's like Newport sub-area, Toledo sub-area, Upper River sub-area. And for each sub-area, we created a list of climate vulnerabilities specific to that sub-area that the advisory group helped weigh in on and make sure that this is the correct way of thinking about it and this is backed by science. So a good example is we've got a climate vulnerability about boat ramps and their susceptibility to failure due to sea level rise. Well, if your sub-area doesn't have boat ramps in it, then that climate vulnerability is not located in that sub-area. So bringing it back to the impact assessment, if you were to do a project in an area and it may have some interactions with various climate vulnerabilities in that sub-area, you just have to address those ones. Some of them won't be applicable. If you're not in the navigation channel, any of the climate vulnerabilities describing the navigation channel aren't applicable to it. So we feel like it's a really good balance between asking project planners to do a little bit more, but while at the same time also asking them to consider how it's going to interact with climate change in the future. So in addition to this project, as part of our needs and gaps assessment, we identified a handful of other things that we think need to be done, but we didn't have the capacity, resources, or authority to do so. So updating Plan Part 5 for estuarine use standards and 9 for future development sites are actually not something we could do under this amount of time. It would require a lot of extra processing and analysis that we didn't have time to do. So the cities and the county are going to be doing that afterwards. And similarly, DLCD is the only entity that can actually provide state level guidance on how to incorporate climate change beyond what we're doing right now with these impact assessments. So we don't have the authority to do that. Hopefully they're going to be able to take this on. They seem interested to do so. And we think that this plan is going to have a lot of really positive outcomes for the Yaquina Bay community. The old plan was kind of difficult to use, even by local planners who administered it, and definitely by folks who actually had land on the estuary. There were a lot of instances in which folks thought that they could do things that they couldn't. And this will help provide a lot of clear information as to what's permissible, what's conditional, what you need to think about if you're going to do something, and what's just not going to be allowed whatsoever. In addition to that, we're very excited about being able to include climate vulnerabilities in that impact assessment process. And then lastly, as I said before, this is sort of a pilot for the rest of the Bay. And we are developing this very large guidance document. It's going to include templates on our work plans and how we've reached out to folks and how we structured our meetings. We're really trying to provide a roadmap for other groups to be able to do this, other watershed groups, to be able to do this in other places with a much lower budget, because we know that it's time intensive. It takes a lot of expertise. We think it can be done, and we think that we can help them along the way. So I just want to say thank you, everyone, and I think I have some time for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ethan. Let's see. We've got a question in the chat. With respect to stakeholder engagement, is there any plan to notify via direct? Chat keeps disappearing, sorry. With respect to stakeholder engagement, is there any plan to notify via direct mail residents, owners that reside within the zones identified in the estuary management plan? Many folks don't have Facebook, which is how I found out.
Yeah, that has come up, I think, at the most recent advisory group meeting. I think it was determined that probably was not going to be within the budget to be able to do so. There are hundreds and hundreds of folks who live on the bay. And if you even take into account folks who live adjacent to or within areas that could be part of the landward migration zones or sea level rise or behind dikes, the amount of people is actually quite impressive. There was interest in doing some direct outreach to folks who actually owned and operated things on the bay, but it was determined that there wasn't actually a good data set for that. In order to actually do that, it would have been a lot of really intensive Google mapping and trying to figure out who owns a pier where. The county doesn't actually have a data set on like who owns piers everywhere, for instance, or at least that's what it seemed like based off of that meeting. It is something that we wanted to address, though.
And Ethan, I'll just jump in that we're doing a lot of sort of publicity as much as we can. So we've notified local newspapers, community boards, chambers of commerce, the library. So we're trying to sort of flood local notice boards and public information locations specifically about the town halls with the link to the website. So if anyone has those kinds of nodes where we can provide information and members of the community would likely see it, sending an email with an attachment and information about the town halls is something that we can very easily do if we know where to go. So any feedback or ideas you have on that, we'd welcome them. And you can see our email addresses there. I'm manis@willamettpartnership.org. Feel free to send me an email later tonight or tomorrow with any ideas that you have. And thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. And I also want to thank our webinar hosts here. We know that you've been helping spread the word. Really appreciate it.
I think we have time for another question if anybody from the audience has one.
So Ethan, maybe we can just put the link to the website in the chat and folks can head there after the presentation and check it out.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Ethan. I know you have to hop off early, so it was great to have you participate. And, next up is Annie Merrill.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the previous presenters. That was really great. So again, my name is Annie, and I'm going to chat with you all about how you can get involved and how your voice can help protect the Yaquina Bay. So first, I just wanted to provide a little context about who I am and why I care about this estuary management plan. So I got my master's degree in marine resource management at Oregon State, and I researched eelgrass and oyster interactions for my thesis work. My estuarine ecology lab was based at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport. So Yaquina Bay literally brought me to Oregon to pursue my career goals. And I feel really lucky to have spent a lot of time in and around the bay. And I have so many fond memories recreating, learning, exploring the tide flats, and helping to restore native Olympia oysters at Coquille Point. I view estuaries as essential ecosystems because they offer so many abundant resources that people rely on for their livelihoods. The Yaquina estuary drives tourism and supports productive fisheries, hosts many jobs and research at Hatfield. It is essentially the lifeblood of Lincoln County. And estuaries and the habitats within them, such as eelgrass and the wetlands we learned about today, also play a critical role in mitigating the effects of climate change and improving water quality, as both panelists discussed. So to me, protecting our estuaries is not just a conservation goal, it's a climate solution that is critical to public health and safety. So I'm putting all my time into advocating for stronger estuary management plans because it is vital to ensuring that coastal communities and our estuaries can be resilient in the face of this change. So in Oregon, we have the statewide land use planning program consisting of 19 planning goals that outline how local governments must plan development and manage natural resources within their jurisdiction. So Ethan was discussing goal 16, which deals with estuarine resources. But the very first goal is goal 1, which requires local governments to provide ample opportunities for citizens to be involved in all phases of the planning process, which is why this public comment period is coming up. So this is arguably the most important part of Oregon land use because it allows people to shape the future of their communities and steward their resources. Thorough public participation leads to more equitable outcomes and ensures that the needs of the community are represented in these local policies. So I'm really happy that you're all here today to learn about how land use in the estuary can help protect the estuarine resources because your voice is really needed in this moment to help influence this plan. So this update is an incredible opportunity to strengthen local policies to meet the future challenges and protect critical resources that sustain the local economy for decades to come. So I'm just going to quickly break down the public process, although Ethan touched on much of this. Okay, so the plan material for the draft was just released and the comment period ends on July 14th at 5 p.m. As Ethan said, leading up to this deadline are a series of local town halls where folks can learn about the planning process, ask lots of questions if you didn't get a chance to today, and provide feedback on the plan material. The first meeting will be next week in Newport on the 6th, followed by one in Toledo, and then again, the last one will be virtual. And so right now is a really important period to shape the plan material because at this stage, it is still a draft plan. So public comments will be incorporated into the plan between July 14th and the end of August. And then following that is the plan adoption process, which will take place in the fall and into the winter. So again, this is when the city and county will hold public hearings where folks can provide testimony to influence the plan that way. However, the plan will be far less malleable at that stage. And if you follow Oregon Shores, we'll be staying on top of this whole local adoption process, and we will be providing you up-to-date information on how to engage in these upcoming public hearings. Okay, so again, the public comments are due on July 14th at 5 p.m. To give Willamette Partnership plenty of time to incorporate feedback. And then written comments can be sent via email to Ethan. His email is right here. And then there's also a survey in the website, which Nicole is going to link in the chat. And people can provide general feedback on that survey form. And then again, you can go to the town halls and provide verbal feedback in person. So those are sort of the 3 avenues for comments at this stage, and the public hearings on the proposed plan will follow later. Excuse me. All right. So now that you know how to comment, here are some general tips for commenting. So first, review the plan material. All material is found on the planning website, which includes maps and which display resource information and management units for every region of the Bay. The document itself, the plan, is really long, and you may not want to read the whole thing, which is okay. So I would just recommend at least reviewing the introduction sections of the plan to get a better understanding of how the document works. And you may, skip to the parts that are most relevant to you, like the management units and areas that you frequently crab or recreate or near your home. I'd also encourage you to look at the restoration and mitigation section if you're interested in protecting our wetlands. And take notes while you review the plan material so that you're ready to write your comments. And then when writing, you should indicate where your perspective is coming from. Are you a business owner on the bayfront? Are you a fisherman? Adding any context about what you value is also really important. And if you're not a resident of Lincoln County, but have some connection to Yaquina Bay, like maybe you're a student in Corvallis, you can still comment, of course. And whatever you can do to organize your comments in a way that makes it easy for the planners to digest your key points will help ensure that feedback is well understood. So you could do this by, setting bullet points or sections. And if you have one major suggestion, you can make that front and center right at the top. And if you see any inaccuracies in the plan that contradicts your local knowledge or research, point that out. And you're not constrained by length, but short and sweet is generally really effective. It's also really important to be kind and encouraging of the planning process. So much hard collaborative work has gone into updating this plan. So it's really useful to planners if you can share what you like about the plan as well and what you think is a major improvement. So we'll be sending out a comment guide to help you write your comments at the end. And then first, I just wanted to emphasize that this update is a really huge improvement to the 1982 plan. This update was desperately needed to modernize the plan material, and it's the first estuary management plan in the state to incorporate climate change vulnerabilities. However, the plan is not perfect, which is why it's so important for diverse voices to offer feedback in this comment period. Our ultimate goal is to make sure the resulting plan is as robust and comprehensive as possible. So Oregon Shores has been following this plan update for months. So we put together some comment recommendations for you all to consider. And these recommendations represent Oregon Shores' perspective, along with other organizations and natural resource professionals, and not necessarily those of the previous panelists, just to be clear. So first, while this current update is vital in modernizing the plan, we need to continue the planning process to ensure that the community has a plan that matches the challenges and opportunities of the future. As Ethan discussed earlier, the development of this plan began by assessing needs and gaps. And through this process, a wide range of needs were identified. And you can find this needs and gaps assessment on the website. The more immediate needs to modernize certain aspects of the plan constitute what is called a tier 1 priority, which is kind of the plan update that we're talking about at present. But a lot of the needs and gaps, the ones that involve more comprehensive long-term planning or more money and funds, were put off for another round of updating, which is the tier 2. So this is why it's really important to continue with that effort after we've completed this current tier 1. So for example, there were some really important sections that were not updated, like the estuarine uses and future development site sections that Ethan mentioned are recommended to continue updating. Issues like sea level rise, habitat migration, endangered species, and loss of habitat like wetlands were not fully addressed and really must be to strengthen the plan's ability to comprehensively manage Yaquina Bay's resources. So to be clear, if we leave the planning effort at tier 1 alone, although there are really great climate vulnerabilities that are built into the impact assessments, the county still will not be equipped to handle all of the climate hazards that are to come, which may put the community at risk. So our first and primary recommendation is that the county commit to the next round of planning after this tier 1 update. So the county and state are also more likely to pursue funds and keep the planning process going with widespread public support. So that's why it's really important to get this comment on record. Also, as Ethan mentioned, the last time the estuary management plan was updated was 40 years ago, and that's a huge gap. So given the dynamic nature of estuaries and the current threats of climate change, which is likely to alter environmental conditions of the bay, it's really important that the plan be adaptive to facilitate future revisions and prevent this 40-year lapse in planning. So this diagram demonstrates this concept of adaptive management, which is an iterative, ongoing process that allows for continuous planning. An adaptive plan also has a process for monitoring plan effectiveness in meeting specific management objectives, so that strategies can be adjusted when conditions change and when new information or scientific data is gathered. So learning from the plan's successes and failures is really key here. So our suggestion is that the Yaquina Bay plan incorporates a method for adaptive management. And this should include steps to evaluate how well various elements of the plan are working to achieve specific management goals. But it could also include triggers to reassess or incorporate new data, say every 5 years, to keep the plan as current as possible and avoid this 40-year lapse. There is also an opportunity to expand mitigation policy in the plan. So at its root, mitigation refers to actions that reduce harm from a specific activity. And in the context of managing natural resources, clearly defining what counts as mitigation is critically important because it proactively prevents destruction of habitat when permitting a development of some kind. So the problem with the concept of mitigation in the Yaquina Bay plan is that it's reactive at present. The plan uses the statewide Planning Goal 16 definition of mitigation, which is an offset strategy to replace estuarine resources through restoration when they are filled in or dredged for a project. However, as we learned earlier, we are losing critical habitat such as wetlands and eelgrass meadows in Yaquina Bay right now. So also restoration is really challenging and costly work. So it is much more productive to prevent and avoid adverse impacts to begin with if we truly wish to maintain a baseline of no net loss habitat throughout the estuary. It's also important to note that the estuary management plan needs to be consistent with this goal 16, which is why the language of mitigation is so narrow in the plan. But goal 16 is the floor and not the ceiling, meaning that mitigation could be understood more broadly in the plan and it would still be consistent with goal 16. So given the cumulative stressors that estuarine habitats face and climate change, reduced water quality and everything, stronger protections for habitats are more important now than ever. And this really should be reflected in the restoration and mitigation policies in the plan. So Oregon Shores strongly suggests that mitigation policy be understood more broadly to include avoiding impacts to critical habitat, to strengthen the meaning and application of mitigation, and to help us reach our restoration goals. So for the last recommendation, natural resource information in Yaquina Bay is quite rich, given how many scientists and students at Hatfield Marine Science Center are currently studying the bay. So this is a research hub that we really should capitalize on. Since 1982, a lot has changed in our understanding of Yaquina Bay as an ecosystem, and so has the field of ecology. So we now know so much more about natural resources found in the bay and how they provide essential ecosystem services that are invaluable to the community. So if you think about what the natural world provides you in your daily life, this might be things like recreation or aesthetical beauty, but also improved water quality and flood mitigation. All of these benefits are called ecosystem services. And Laura described these benefits earlier in the context of wetlands. So at present, the Yaquina Bay plan does not have very detailed descriptions of the natural resources present in each management unit, or any language about the value those resources offer other than stating that they are important. So this matters because it makes the special policies and management objectives for each management unit very vague. And when management objectives are vague, how can they be reached, right? So as part of this update, we also have new resource inventories and maps, which Ethan mentioned. which could then be used to reevaluate the management units and update descriptions with more current information about these resources. So we recommend that the management unit section in the plan include more detailed data and descriptions of the natural resources present to more accurately reflect ecosystem conditions, which will then inform decision-making about what types of uses should be permitted. And this might occur in tier 2, but it's equally important no matter when it happens. Okay, so that's it for my comment recommendations. But if you want to learn more about these recommendations or other tips for commenting, please check out our comment guide, and the link will be dropped in the chat. Also in the chat will be a link to the website that houses all of the plan material and information about the town halls, as well as the map viewer tool to look at updated plan maps and resource inventories. There's also a Zoom link for the July 11th town hall event, and I encourage you all to attend those town hall events. As you are going through the plan material, I also encourage you to really consider if you think this plan is ready to handle all the uncertainties and challenges of the future. You know, consider what's missing. Are there things that you value most about the estuary, and are they protected? Are they represented in the plan? Also, is the plan accurate based on your local and professional knowledge? Also important to consider, you know, what are the strengths? We all have a really important opportunity right now, and quite frankly, a responsibility to help make sure that this plan is as robust as possible. So if comments cannot be adopted in this phase of the planning process because of funding or time constraints, that is further justification for a second phase of planning. So it's really important to have those comments on record. And then also, as Ethan mentioned earlier, this Yaquina Bay plan update is also going to be used as a template for updating all of the other estuaries in the state. So the value of your comments transcend beyond this estuary. And I just want to thank you all for listening and for doing your part to be stewards of Yaquina Bay. This work is really important. And I also want to thank our previous speakers, Laura and Ethan, and all the planners who have done such amazing work to vastly improve the functionality and state of the Yaquina Bay Estuary Management Plan. Yeah, it truly took a village and yeah, many years and tons of resources to make this happen. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Annie. We'll open it up to questions and comments now. You can put a question or comment in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and questions for any of the panelists. And I will mention, even though Ethan is not with us, Nicole Maines is also with Willamette Partnership.
Annie, while we're waiting for folks to maybe think of a question, would I be able to just show folks the website and just orient them and specifically point them to the cheat sheet or fact sheet that we delivered? I don't know if I can share my screen.
Absolutely. Yes, please do.
All right. Hang on one second.
I think you can share your screen, no problem.
Yes. All right, so I'm just bringing up the website that Ethan and I linked to. This is the online site that provides all of the resources that are available for public review. So a link to a needs and gaps assessment. And then on the right here in particular, this is where you can download a PDF of the draft plan. And then right here is this fact sheet that kind of provides, I'm just gonna click to it here, instead of I don't know how 100+ pages of planner speak, we've created this summary that tries to describe the contents of the plan, the process in plain English. It talks a little bit about goal 16 that we've been referring to. It provides some information about estuaries. It talks about the process and also talks about the high level revisions that are part of the plan, and then provides information about who's on the steering committee and the advisory group, and on the project team. So that's a nice little overview for folks just to orient yourself before you dive into the more technical document. And then also just wanted to point out the map viewer that's being developed in partnership with the DLCD. And that allows you to actually go in and explore the data layers that are associated with this region. And so up here on the right, there's a little welcome screen, and you can click on the Maps tab and then explore these different layers that are being made available now to planners and to the community. This is a public resource. So you can look at head of tide data, you can look at ownership data, you can look at the national wetland inventory data, and you don't need special software to view this. You can view it on any web browser. So really useful and informative for folks.
That's awesome. That's such a great addition to the plan material.
Okay, we have a technical question, but can you explain why the plan does, oops, my chat keeps disappearing. Can you explain why the plan doesn't use CMECS classification that the state has adopted to define Oregon estuary boundaries?
Debbie, I don't know that I can answer that question in particular. We're using CMEX data for a bunch of other layers. So for aquatic, biotic, geoform, and substrate. But in terms of the actual boundary, I'm not sure when that decision was made, but we can find out.
It might be a definition thing in goal 16 about the mean high water being the boundary.
I think it is. I don't want to speculate until I have that reference right in front of me, but I think you're right, Amy.
Well, let's hope not, because mean high water is the lower boundary for tidal wetlands. Mature tidal marsh is found above mean high water. That's very old information if that's being used anywhere.
And that is part of the challenge with goal 16. And the guidance document that Ethan referenced is our opportunity to point out where goal 16 needs to be updated. That is beyond the purview of this process for Yaquina Bay. But to Annie's point about why comments are so critical is that the alignment with goal 16 is one objective of this plan update, but there is a sort of modernization of goal 16 that is also needed. And that's a process that the state needs to take on at a sort of bigger scale and longer time scale than this particular project. But understanding where goal 16 has limitations or actually opportunities for being innovative and creative about creating mechanisms to encourage certain types of decision making or information gathering. You know, we're trying to balance those two objectives, but definitely goal 16, there are opportunities for updating it, and DLCD is aware of that, and it's just not a process that we can tackle in this particular project.
Okay, thank you.
It's so interesting to me, just to jump in, because the whole reason why we developed the CMEX mapping was to support estuary management. And so there's got to be a way to bring this into the process. It would be actually super helpful to have someone from DLCD here to talk with about this. As an example, those diked areas are identified as potential restoration sites, but other than that, they aren't mapped in the plan as far as I can see. And I'm curious if any of you have sort of thoughts on how these large portions of the estuary, the historical estuary, are handled in terms of planning. they aren't management units because they're not currently subject to tidal influence, but they're very important when we think about future conditions under sea level rise, for instance.
Right, absolutely. I do think some folks from DLCD will be at the town halls, so that's a good time to ask high-level questions about Goal 16 or anything to do with state level planning. But yeah, that is a limitation. We've also seen limitations with Goal 16 and Goal 17 being delineated in the land use process. Because that doesn't allow upslope migration of habitat to be thoroughly considered when the estuary management plan only deals with the estuary boundary. And if they have a kind of rigid definition that is the mean high water line, how do you plan for habitats to migrate? It would be more reactive rather than proactive, that eventually that land will fall under the estuary management plan because it'll succumb to sea level rise, but you can't really plan for it in advance with the current structure.
And just to confirm, someone from DLCD will be at each of the town halls to provide sort of an agency response to those particular issues and questions. We're very careful and cautious about not speaking for DLCD or acting on their behalf. We're really about sort of managing process and ensuring good process and transparency, but we don't have any kind of influence or authority on state level policy or speaking for DLCD. So we try to be very careful about that.
There's a follow-up comment question in the chat. It's from Virginia. Our property on the bay used to have brackish water at high tides. No, it no longer does. What happened? Any speculation on that, Laura?
I'd have to know where the property is. Is it separated from the bay by some kind of barrier to tidal flow? Is there a culvert that got blocked? It could be any number of things. Interesting question.
I know this was a lot of information to digest. We threw so much at you in the past hour and a half. So please go and review the plan material, let this all sink in, and go to the town halls and ask questions there. I think that's a really good place to bring forth your questions and comments.
Which of the town halls is virtual again?
On July 11th, I believe.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Nicole, you want to recap when the town halls are just real quickly?
Right. So July 6th is in Newport at the Yacht Club. July 10th is in Toledo at the City Council. And July 11th is on Zoom. So they all run from 6 to 7:30. They'll be, we'll sort of let people join and we'll be doing a formal presentation very similar to the one that you just heard, just to give folks an overview and a grounding. And then you'll have representatives from the project team, from DLCD, from the county, Lincoln County Planning Department, and then hopefully a couple representatives from the cities of Toledo and Newport, and possibly the ports of Newport and Toledo as well. And if they're available, our partners from the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. So we're trying to bring a broad diversity of expertise to the panel, and we'll be doing Q&A until folks are done with questions. For the in-person events, we will have maps set out, hard copies of documents, and a lot of information that has been translated into Spanish. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that the website, that update page is also available in Spanish. And so we're just hoping to provide an opportunity for folks to like learn a little bit, have a really solid grounding in the plan, but then also ask detailed questions from a range of different perspectives and jurisdictions. So the county planners have a different set of expertise and background and perspective in terms of their experience implementing the plan for the past decades. And then DLCD will be able to bring sort of the policy perspective and also be talking about process beyond just Yaquina Bay and Coos Bay as well. So hope to see you there.
Thank you for all
the meeting you at, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying thank you to Nicole for adding all of that.
And thank you to all the panelists and for Nicole also. Great presentations. And I do encourage everybody to attend at least one of the town halls and get engaged. This is our community and our estuary. With that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for everybody, and particularly a shout out to the big audience that we've had on this. It's really great to see the level of interest in the estuary management planning. So thanks all.
Thank you for organizing it.
Yeah, thank you everyone. There'll also be a recorded link to this presentation. We're also probably gonna post it on our YouTube channel, on the Oregon Shores YouTube channel. So yeah, you're welcome to share that out for any folks who weren't able to make it. And yeah, we'll send you the comment guide. And yeah, we hope to see you get engaged. Thank you, everyone.